There is a bend in the Black Warrior River, in the green heart of Alabama, where the water slows and turns the color of dark tea. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. The river curls there, the way a sleeping cat curls its tail on the eastern bank. The land rises in a long flat shelf above the floodplain, and on that shelf, hidden now under soft southern grass, sit 29 earthen mounds. They sleep in the shade of old oaks and pecans, their flat tops worn smooth by 800 years of rain. If you stand on the riverbank at first light, you can see them. The mist comes off the water in slow ribbons. The mounds rise out of that mist like the backs of great grey whales. Some are small, no taller than a man. Others climb 60 feet into the air, broad as a city block at the base. Their sides are gentle now, rounded by time, but their shapes still hold the careful geometry of something planned. This place is called Moundville, and the question that hangs over it is older than the country it sits in. 900 years ago, this river bend was a city. Not a village, not a camp. A real city with thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder inside a high wooden wall. There were houses with thatched roofs and packed clay floors. There were workshops where craftsmen carved stone and shaped copper. There was a great open plaza where ceremonies rolled on for days at a time. Smoke rose from 1,000 hearths. Drums sounded through the summer nights. Corn grew in long green rows in the bottomlands by the river. By some counts, 10,000 people lived here, or came here, or passed through. It was one of the largest cities in all of North America, bigger than London was in the same century, bigger than most towns the Spanish would later build along this coast. And then, slowly, the people walked away. Not all at once, not in a single bad year. The leaving stretched across generations like a long exhale. The houses came down, the fires went out, the plaza emptied, but the mounds stayed, and the burials kept coming. For a time, the city of the living quietly became something else. A city of the dead, a place where people no longer lived, but where they still brought their honored ones to rest. That is the riddle nobody has solved. Archaeologists have been digging here for more than 100 years. They have measured the mounds and mapped the plaza. They have lifted thousands of pots from the red Alabama earth. They have sketched the bones of chiefs laid out in copper and pearl. They have read the soil and the seeds and the broken pieces of clay. And still, when you ask them the simple question, they grow quiet. What happened here? Why did a thriving city soften into a silent ground of graves? Was it drought, slow and patient, drying the corn in the fields? Was it the falling apart of a ruling family, the way old kingdoms come undone? Was it a change of heart, a turning inward, a new way of seeing the world that asked the living to step back and give the land to the ancestors? Or was it something else, something that does not fit any of those neat boxes? The river keeps its own counsel. It slides past the mounds the way it has always slid past them, brown and slow and patient. In the spring, it floods the lower fields and leaves silt as black as coffee grounds. In the fall, it shrinks back and shows its sandbars pale as bone. Sometimes, when the bank caves in, a pot comes loose, a piece of jaw, a bead of shell. The water gives up small pieces of the old city, the way a sleeper murmurs in a dream. Tonight we are going to sit by that river. We are going to walk through the tall grass between the mounds and listen for what they remember. We will meet the chief, who wore copper on his chest and pearls in his hair. We will see the Falcon dancer painted on the side of a clay bowl. We will hear the silence that settled over this place around the year 1450, and we will try, together, to understand it. The mounds are still here. They are still sleeping, and the story begins where the river bends. The year was 1540. A man named Hernando de Soto pushed his army through the green heart of what would one day be Alabama. He wore steel and rust. His horses wore iron shoes that left half moons in the red clay behind him. Marched soldiers in helmets shaped like upturned bowls, priests with wooden crosses, and dogs trained for war. They carried muskets that smelled of black powder and old smoke. They carried fevers too, though they did not know it yet. The land they walked was older than any kingdom in Spain. Longleaf pines rose like cathedral pillars, their tops swaying in a slow southern wind. Cane brakes grew thick along the creeks, the stalks tall as two men, rattling in the breeze like dry bones in a sack. The air smelled of pine resin, river mud, and the sweet rot of fallen magnolia leaves. Spanish moss hung from the oaks in pale grey curtains. Light fell through it in soft bars, the colour of old honey. They had been told there were cities here, cities with towers, cities ruled by chiefs who wore pearls the size of plums. The soldiers laughed at first. Then they began to see the smoke, thin blue threads rising from far ridges, trails worn knee-deep into the earth by countless bare feet, fields of corn stretching wider than any field they had seen in Castile, the green stalks marching in straight rows that no wild land would ever grow on its own. Late summer found them moving through valleys hot as a smith's forge. The men sweated under their padded jackets. Their leather boots cracked. Mosquitoes rose in clouds at dusk and settled like a second skin. At night they slept in clearings, where the stars looked unfamiliar, where owls called in voices no Spanish owl had ever made. And somewhere, off to the south and west, lay a great brown river that the people of this land called the River of the Black Warrior. Whether De Soto's men ever stood beside that river is a thing the historians still argue over. The chronicles they left behind are tangled. The names of towns are written down in Spanish ears and Spanish spellings, twisted from their first sound. A place called Apafalaya, a chief called Tascaloosa, a great town somewhere along a wide, dark water. Some scholars believe these names point straight to the bend in the Black Warrior. Others believe the army passed close, but never quite arrived. The river kept its secrets, as rivers do. What the Spanish did see, they could not quite explain. They saw towns ringed by walls of upright logs, taller than a horse and rider. They saw temples raised on flat-topped hills of earth, with steep wooden stairs climbing their sides. They saw plazas swept clean as a church floor. They saw chiefs carried on litters, fanned by attendants, dressed in white deerskin, and shells that flashed in the sun like coins. The soldiers had crossed an ocean expecting jungle and savagery. Instead, they found order, geometry, a world arranged with care. Picture them standing at the edge of one of these towns. The afternoon light is the color of beaten brass. The earthen mounds rise from the flat ground like loaves of bread set out to cool. Each one wears a building on its top, a wooden temple thatched with river cane, its walls painted in white clay and red ochre. Smoke curls from cooking fires. Children run between houses with sloping bark roofs. Women carry water in clay jars, decorated with strange black designs. A drum beats somewhere, slow and steady, like a sleeping heart. The Spanish wrote it all down with hands that trembled from fever. They described the chiefs. They described the feasts. They described the rivers of corn beer, poured into bowls so fine they looked like polished stone. And then they marched on, leaving behind their germs and their iron and their confusion. Within a generation, smallpox would sweep these valleys like a winter wind. Towns would empty. Names would be forgotten. The chronicles would lie in Spanish libraries, gathering dust for 300 years. By the time anyone returned to count what was left, the great town at the bend of the Black Warrior was already a quiet place. The Mounds were still there. The Plaza was still there. But the houses were gone. The smoke was gone. The drums were gone. Only the shape of the city remained, pressed into the red earth like a fingerprint on clay. The Spanish had walked past a riddle, and they never knew how strange a riddle they had missed. Picture a man walking along the river path on a cool spring morning around the year 1250. His name has been lost to time, but you can still see him clearly in your mind. He is perhaps 30 years old. His skin is brown and weathered from sun and wind. His hair is long and dark, pulled back from a face marked with thin lines of black paint along the cheekbones. He carries a woven basket on his back, full of river cane he cut at first light. His name is gone, but his people are still known. They were Mississippians. They lived in what we now call Alabama, and they had already been building this city for 200 years before our Walker was born. To put that in plain words, the great mounds rising above him were older than most of the stone cathedrals of Europe, older than Notre Dame, older than the spires of Cologne. Walk beside him for a moment. He moves with the steady pace of someone who has walked this path 1,000 times. The earth under his bare feet is packed hard and smooth. To his left, the Black Warrior slides past in long silver curves. To his right, cornfields stretch out in tidy green rows, tended by women in plain skirts of woven bark cloth. Children chase grasshoppers between the stalks. Smoke rises from low thatched houses in soft grey ribbons. The walker passes an old woman grinding corn on a flat stone. Her hands are knotted and quick. She nods at him without breaking her rhythm. He nods back. They both know each other by clan, by blood, by the slow, patient web of a town where everyone knows everyone. Her name might have been something like Sky Heron, or Bright Shell, or a word we will never recover. She has lived here all her life. So did her mother. So did her mother's mother. Try to picture the daily shape of these people. The men wore breechcloths in summer and deerskin cloaks in winter. Some shaved the sides of their heads and left a single ridge of hair down the center, stiffened with bear grease. The women wore long skirts woven from mulberry bark. They strung shell beads in long ropes around their necks and wrists. The elite, the chiefs and priests, wore copper plates polished to the color of fire and feathers from birds that lived 1,000 miles away. These were farmers first. They planted corn and beans and squash in the rich black soil of the river bottom. They fished the Black Warrior with nets of twisted plant fiber. They hunted deer in the oak forests beyond the fields. They knew which roots cured fevers and which leaves dyed cloth blue. They knew the songs for planting and the songs for harvest and the songs for setting a body to rest. And they were builders. Astonishing builders. Every mound you can see at Moundville today was raised one basket of earth at a time. Think about that for a moment. Our walker, returning home with his river cane, might pass a line of men and women hauling baskets of clay from a borrow pit. They sing as they walk. They dump their loads, stamp the earth flat, and turn back for another trip. A single mound might take generations to finish. Grandfathers begin work that grandsons complete. The walker has a wife and 2 small children waiting in a thatched house near the plaza. His house has a square shape, with walls of wattle and daub and a roof of river cane bundles. Inside, there is a fire pit, a sleeping bench, a few clay pots, and a basket of dried beans. His daughter is 4 years old and already learning to weave. His son is 2 and clings to his mother's hip. These were not simple people. They were not savages waiting for history to find them. They had laws, religion, art, music, medicine, mathematics, and a calendar that tracked the sun and stars with quiet precision. They had a class system with rulers and farmers and craftspeople and warriors. They had marriage customs and funeral rites and stories told around fires that had been burning in one form or another for centuries. And here is the gentle puzzle that hangs over them. We know they lived. We can see their houses and their pots and their bones, but we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the language they spoke at the dinner fire. We do not know the names of the man with the river cane, or the woman grinding corn, or the children chasing grasshoppers. Their voices have all gone quiet. Only the mounds still speak. Picture the plaza at the heart of Moundville on an ordinary morning. The sun is just clearing the tops of the cypress trees along the river, and the light comes in low and gold. Yea, soft mist still hangs over the grass, thin as breath on a window. The plaza itself is wide and flat, an open green field shaped like a careful rectangle, big enough to hold a small town. Around its edges rise the mounds, soft green hills with flat tops, like loaves of bread set out to cool. Smoke drifts up from 100 cook fires. It curls between the houses and gathers in the still air. The houses sit in tidy rows beyond the plaza, made of bent saplings and woven cane, plastered smooth with river mud. Their roofs wear thick mats of grass thatch, weathered to a soft silver brown. Each one has a small garden patch beside it, and the gardens are full of corn that stands taller than a man. A woman steps out of her doorway with a clay bowl on her hip. The bowl is the color of dark honey, polished until it shines. She walks down a packed earth path toward the river, her bare feet quiet on the cool ground. Other women are already there, kneeling at the water's edge, washing roots and laughing softly to each other. The black warrior moves past them slow and brown, wide as a meadow, carrying leaves and bits of sun on its back. Up on one of the smaller mounds, a man tends a fire that never goes out. He feeds it slivers of cedar and watches the smoke rise straight up into the pale morning sky. His job is simple and old. The fire has been burning since before his grandfather was born. He brushes the ashes aside with a wooden paddle and listens to the doves calling from the trees. Children run through the plaza in loose packs, their feet kicking up little clouds of dust. They chase a small dog. They throw cane darts at a rolling stone disc and shout when the throws go wide. Old men sit on woven mats in the shade of a council house, smoking and talking in low voices. They speak of the planting moon, of a cousin's new baby, of a flock of ducks seen at dawn near the bend. The plaza is the center of everything. It is the marketplace, the dance ground, the meeting hall under the open sky. Today it is quiet, with only a few traders setting out their goods on blankets. One man has bright shells from somewhere far to the south. Another has lumps of dark stone, good for making knives. A young woman lays out pots she shaped herself, their sides decorated with curling lines and the shape of a hand pressed into the clay. By mid-morning, the smell of cooking spreads everywhere. There is corn boiling in clay pots, and fish wrapped in green leaves laid on hot stones. There is the sweet smell of squash baking in coals, and the sharp green smell of fresh beans. Somewhere, a grandmother is grinding hickory nuts into a soft paste with a wooden pestle, and the steady thump of her work carries across the houses like a slow heartbeat. This is the rhythm of Moundville at its peak. Plant in spring, fish in summer, harvest in fall. Sit close to the fire in winter. Trade with the travelers who come up the river in long dugout canoes. Pay quiet respect to the chief who lives on the great mound, the one taller than all the others. Watch the priests climb the steep wooden stairs at dawn and dusk, their copper ornaments catching the light. 10,000 people lived here, give or take. They lived inside a wooden wall that wrapped the town like a long arm. They knew their neighbors. They knew which path led to which cousin's door. They knew where the best clay was, and which bend in the river held the fattest catfish, and which patch of woods turned bright red first in the fall. It was an ordinary place, in the way any great city is ordinary to the people who live in it. The mounds were not strange to them. They were simply the shape of the world, the way hills are the shape of the world to anyone born among them. The smoke rose, the river ran, the corn grew, the children laughed in the plaza. Nothing in that bright morning told them their city would one day go silent. Nothing told them the plaza would empty, the houses would fall, and the mounds would sleep alone under the stars for 500 years. The river has a name, and the name has a story. People call it the Black Warrior. On a map, it runs through west central Alabama like a dark ribbon, looping past low bluffs and cypress flats, gathering creeks the way a hand gathers loose thread. The water itself is the color of strong tea where it pools deep, and the color of old iron where the current quickens over stone. At dawn, the surface holds a thin coat of mist, soft as breath on cold glass. At dusk it turns to hammered copper under a low sun. The name is older than the state, older than the steamboats that once worked these bends. The river took its name from a man, and the man took his name from a color that ran deeper than skin. The story comes down through several mouths, and each mouth shapes it a little differently. Most tellings agree on the bones. There was a chief, long after the great city above the bluff had gone quiet. His people lived along these waters in scattered towns of cane houses and cornfields. They knew the old mounds the way a child knows the shape of a sleeping grandfather in the next room. They did not climb them carelessly. They did not speak of them at night. This chief was called Tuscaloosa in the Choctaw tongue. Tushka meant warrior, Lusa meant black. Together, the syllables made a single word that the Spanish, when they came riding up through the pine country in the autumn of 1540, would write down as best they could. Tuscaloosa, Tuscaloosa, the Black Warrior. He was, by every account that survives, an enormous man. The Spanish chroniclers wrote that he stood a full head and shoulders above the tallest man in their company, and the Spaniards were not small. They wrote that he sat on a high seat carried by his attendants, that a feathered banner waved above him like a slow, dark wing, and that he looked at the strangers without surprise, as if he had been expecting them for a long time. He did not stand when they approached. He did not smile. He let the silence do the work that words usually do. Hernando de Soto rode at the head of the Spanish column. He had crossed half a continent looking for gold, and he had found rivers and fevers and forests instead. When he met the Black Warrior in a town somewhere along these very waters, he must have felt, for a moment, that he was standing in the presence of something he could not name. The chief wore a long mantle of feathers that fell past his knees. His skin, the Spanish said, was the deepest shade they had seen in all their wandering. His eyes did not move when De Soto spoke through the trembling mouth of a translator. What passed between those two men is part of the record and part of the legend. The chief agreed to guide the Spanish further, He walked with them, or rode in his litter. For many days he spoke little. He smiled less, and somewhere along the road, the small thing happened, the thing that was off, the thing the Spanish noticed, but could not quite explain. The chief kept looking back, not at the column behind him, at the river, at the country to the north, where the great quiet mounds stood above the water. He looked the way a man looks at a house he used to live in. He looked the way a man looks at a grave. One of the Spanish soldiers, a man named Rangel, who kept a careful diary, wrote a single odd line about that long march. He wrote that the chief sometimes hummed a low song under his breath, and that the song had no words the translators could catch, and that it sounded, to Rangel's ear, like the sound a wind makes when it moves through a building no one lives in anymore. That is all he wrote. He did not explain. He did not guess. He simply set the sentence down on the page and moved on to the next day's march. The river kept the name, aft, everything that came later, after the battle and the smoke and the slow folding shut of an old world. The water that ran past the silent capital still carried the chief's name in its current, Black Warrior, a man and a color, and a question that nobody on that march thought to ask. What was he looking back at when he looked back at the mounds? What did he hear in the wind that the Spanish did not hear? The river knows. The river is not telling. Long before the archaeologists came with their measuring tapes and small brushes, the people who lived along the Black Warrior had their own stories about the man who once stood on top of the tallest mound. The farmers told them, the fishermen told them, the old women who sold sweet potatoes from baskets on the porch of the country store told them best of all, in voices low and slow, like honey dripping from a spoon. They called him simply the chief, or sometimes the Sun Lord, or the wearer of bright things. Nobody could agree on the name his own people had used, because that name had been carried away on the wind centuries ago. But everyone agreed on what he looked like when he walked down from the high mound to greet the people gathered in the plaza below. He wore copper, sheets of it, hammered thin as a leaf, polished until they caught the morning sun, and threw it back in 100 little fires. The copper hung from his ears and rested on his chest in the shape of a great bird with spread wings. His arms carried bands of it, snug against the muscle, warm from his skin. When he moved, the copper whispered a sound like rain on still water. He wore pearls too, strings of them, freshwater pearls from the mussels the river gave up every spring, white and pink, and the soft grey of doves. They hung around his neck in long ropes, layered like the rings of a tree. The old folks said a single rope of those pearls would have bought a horse and wagon in their grandfather's time. The chief wore dozens. In the country store at the edge of Hale County, a man named Elias would sit by the wood stove in winter and tell his version. His grandfather had farmed the bottomland near the mounds, and his grandfather's grandfather before him. Elias said the chief was so heavy with riches he could barely walk on flat ground. That was why they built him a hill of earth to stand on. He didn't need to come down. The people came up to him, and only as far as the steps allowed. At the tavern on the river road, the stories got a little wilder. A riverboat man named Jubal once told a table full of listeners that the chief never spoke at all. He raised one finger and the harvest started. He raised two and the dancing began. He turned his face toward the sun, and the priests around him fell to their knees. The tavern keeper, wiping a glass, said his own mother had heard the same thing from a Creek woman who passed through in the 1880s outside the white clappered church on Sunday mornings. The talk turned more careful, more hushed. Folks didn't want to be caught telling tales the preacher might frown on, but the deacons would gather under the oak tree and trade pieces of it anyway. One said the chief was buried with a copper plate over his face. Another said no, the plate was on his chest, and his hands were folded over a knife of polished stone. A third said his teeth had been filed to little points, the way the men of his rank were marked from boyhood. None of them had ever seen these things. The mounds were still mostly sealed in those years, their secrets cradled in red clay. But the stories had been passed down so long and from so many directions that they had the weight of memory, even when the memory belonged to nobody anyone could name. Some pieces of the picture came from places far away. A traveling salesman might mention a museum case up in Tennessee where a copper bird from the Black Warrior Valley sat behind glass. A school teacher who had read a magazine article would describe pots dug up nearby, painted with a hand inside an eye. The pieces drifted in. The pieces drifted back out. Nobody held them all at once. What stayed steady through every telling was the image of the man at the top, a figure bright as a struck match in the green river valley, surrounded by smoke and song and the soft slap of the water below. The locals believed he was real. They believed he had stood there. They differed only on what he meant. Some said he was a king, plain and simple, no different from the kings in storybooks. Some said he was a priest who spoke for the sun and the corn and the dead. Some said he was both, and that the difference between those things hadn't existed yet in the world he ruled. The river kept its own opinion. It rolled past the mounds and said nothing at all. Climb with me if you would, up the long green slope of Mound A. It sits in the center of the old plaza, like the heart of a sleeping body. The grass is soft underfoot. The earth beneath that grass is older than any building still standing in the country. Workers carried it here, one basket at a time, climbing wooden ramps with damp clay on their shoulders, season after season, for longer than most kingdoms last. Mound A rises about 56 feet from the floor of the plaza. It is wide and flat on top, shaped like a loaf of bread set down by a giant hand. From the river, it looks like a low green hill. From the plaza below, it looks like a stage built for the gods. The slopes are smooth and steady, cut on four sides, oriented to the four directions. Even now, after 1,000 summers of rain and 1,000 winters of frost, the lines hold. The corners still point where the builders meant them to point. Stand on that flat summit, and the world opens up around you. You can see the river bending in a slow silver curve. You can see the line of the other mounds, 28 of them, scattered across the bottom land, like a constellation pressed into the earth. You can see the dark hem of the forest where the swamp begins. The wind up here moves differently. It comes off the water cool and steady, smelling of mud and pine and old leaves. Now, here is the strange thing. The story of this place did not begin with Moundville. The people who raised these mounds were the heirs of a tradition that stretched back centuries before the first basket of earth was tipped onto this ground. Their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had built mounds in other river valleys. Their songs already knew the shape of a flat-topped hill. Their priests already knew how to read the sky over a wide, cleared plaza when they came to this bend in the Black Warrior. Around the year 1100, they were not inventing something new. They were planting an old seed in fresh soil. Long before that, even, this land had been walked. Stone tools sleep in the lower layers of the riverbank, chipped by hunters who tracked deer through these woods when mammoths still roamed farther north. Pottery shards, plain and brown, belonged to people who lived here 1,000 years before Moundville rose. Their names are gone, Their songs are gone, but their fires once warmed the same dirt that now holds the bones of the mound builders. So when you climb Mound A, you are not climbing only 1,000 years of work. You are climbing a much older idea. The idea that Earth itself can be sacred. The idea that lifting up the ground brings the people closer to the upper world and the dead closer to the sky. That idea drifted down the rivers of the south for ages like seed on wind before it found this bend and took root in its grandest form. From the top of Mound A, the Mississippian world looked very large and very ordered. To the north, the chief's house once stood, painted white, its roof thatched in tight bundles of river cane. To the south, the plaza stretched flat and empty, swept clean for ceremony. To the east, the sun rose over the river at a careful angle the priests knew by heart. To the west, the sun set behind the burial mounds, sinking into the country of the ancestors. The whole place was a map of the cosmos, pressed into the floodplain. Above, below, the living, the dead. That is what makes the later silence so heavy. Because by the late 1300s, something began to change. The houses inside the wall thinned out. The cooking fires grew fewer. The plaza, once loud with 10,000 voices, fell quiet. And yet, the mounds kept growing. The graves kept filling. The ceremonies kept happening, only now for fewer living and more dead. The city was slowly turning, some researchers say, into a necropolis, a place where the bones outnumbered the breath. Other scholars see it differently. They say the people simply moved out to smaller farms along the river and still came back to Moundville for the great gatherings, the way folks today drive to a country church for Easter. The center stayed sacred. The center stayed busy. Only the daily life moved away. Stand on Mound long enough, and the wind seems to carry both stories at once. A city of the living, scattering like sparks. A city of the dead, gathering its long roll call beneath the grass. And under it all, that older, deeper idea still humming. Lift up the earth, bring the sky down closer. Remember. The man who first traced the war did not set out to find it. He came to Moundville with a notebook, a shovel, and a question that had kept him up at night for months. His name was Clarence Bloomfield Moore, and he was a gentleman scholar from Philadelphia who steamed up the Black Warrior in the autumn of 1905. He had heard stories of the mounds from river pilots and farmers. He wanted to see them with his own eyes before another season of plowing wore them down. Moore moved through the site like a man walking through an empty cathedral. He counted the mounds. He measured them. He sketched the plaza in careful pencil lines. And then, somewhere between Mound A and the cornfields that edged the bluff, he began to notice something the farmers had never bothered to mention. The ground rose in a low curving ridge that wrapped around the heart of the city. Not a road, not a creek bed, something built. He followed it for hours. The ridge dipped and rose, and dipped again, tracing a long, lazy arc across the flat land above the river. In some places, it had been almost flattened by a century of plows. In others, it still stood waist high, soft as a sleeping animal under the grass. He marked it on his map with a thin dotted line and a question mark. He did not yet have a name for what he was seeing. The men who came after him gave it a name. They called it the Stockade, and once they began to dig, they understood what Moore had only guessed at. Beneath the ridge lay the dark stains of old post holes, thousands of them. Each one was the ghost of a log that had once stood upright, sunk deep into the earth, lashed to its neighbors with rope and bark. The wall had been tall, perhaps 15 feet high. It had been thick, perhaps 2 layers deep. It had wrapped the entire town on 3 sides, and the river had closed the 4th inside. The wall stood the plaza, the mounds, the houses, the workshops, the granaries. Outside the wall stood the fields and the woods and the wide open world. Whoever built this town had decided at some point that the line between inside and outside needed to be drawn in wood and sweat and stone. Later diggers found something else. Set into the wall at careful intervals were bastions, square towers that pushed out from the line like the teeth of a comb. From the top of a bastion, a man could see the ground at the base of the wall. He could see anyone walking toward the gate. He could see the river bend and the path through the trees. That is the puzzle that the investigators of Moundville have wrestled with ever since. A wall like that takes years to build. It eats whole forests. It requires hundreds of people swinging axes and dragging logs from miles away. Nobody builds a thing like that for decoration. Nobody builds it for ceremony alone. A wall like that gets built because someone, somewhere, is afraid. And yet, there is almost no evidence of a battle at Moundville. No mass graves of warriors. No layer of ash from a burned town. No arrowheads driven into bone. The wall stood watch for generations, and as far as the shovels can tell, it was never tested. Whatever danger it was built against either never came, or came so quietly that it left no scar on the soil. Some researchers think the wall went up early, when the city was still young, and rivals along the river still pressed against its borders. Once Moundville grew large enough, its sheer size became its protection, and the wall fell into disrepair. Others think the wall stood as a sacred boundary, a ring of wood that separated the holy ground of the chief and the priests from the common world beyond. The bastions in this reading were not guard towers, but watch posts for ceremony, places where men in copper headdresses stood at solstice to greet the sun. A third group will tell you the wall was both at once, a boundary against enemies and a boundary against spirits, a line that kept the wrong things out and the right things in. What the investigators wished they hadn't found, in the end, was the silence. They had hoped the wall would tell them who the people of Moundville feared. Instead, the wall only told them that fear, or reverence, or some feeling that lived between the two, had once been strong enough to move a forest. The rest of the story, the wall has kept to itself. To understand a place like Moundville, you have to talk to people who have stood on it, not the scholars, not the men with shovels. The farmers, the fishermen, the river guides, the old folks who grew up running barefoot across those grass-covered slopes. They tell the quiet stories, the ones that don't make the books. A woman named Edna May once said she could remember her grandfather pointing at the corn rows along the river bottom. He told her the dirt down there grew anything you put in it. Beans came up tall as a child. Squash spread wide as a wagon wheel. And the corn, he said, the corn grew so thick, the rows whispered to each other in the wind. He believed the old people had blessed that soil, not with magic exactly, with time, with bones, with every harvest they had ever sung over. The dirt remembered them, he said. The dirt was holding its breath. A catfish man named Roy used to set his trot lines just downriver from the big mound. He fished that bend for 40 years. He told a story about a night in late August, the moon hanging fat over the water, his lantern smoking in the bow of his jumboat. He said the river that night was the color of warm tea. The cypress knees rose up like little brown hooded figures along the bank. And he heard something, not a voice, not music, a low steady sound like 100 people humming together far away. It came rolling down the river from the direction of the mounds. He sat still in his boat. He let the line drift. The sound went on for maybe a minute, maybe two. Then it faded into the frogs and the crickets. He never told his wife. He never told the preacher. He told one nephew once, and the nephew told it again. There was a school teacher in Tuscaloosa, a man named Hollis, who used to take his students out to the mounds in the spring. He said the strangest thing happened the first time he climbed Mound A at sunrise. He had timed it for the equinox on a guess, because he had read somewhere that the old builders watched the sky. He stood up there in the cold grey light. He watched the sun come up over the flat top of another mound across the plaza. And he said the light didn't just rise, it clicked into place, like a key turning in a lock. He felt, for one long second, that he was standing inside a machine, a clock made of grass and dirt. He said he could almost hear it ticking under his feet. An old Choctaw man named Simon, who lived south of the river, once told a young archaeologist that his grandmother had taught him the calendar of the sky. She did not call it that. She just showed him which stars to plant by, which moon meant the catfish would run, which sunset on the long mound meant the corn was ready to bend. He said his grandmother had learned it from her grandmother, and her grandmother had learned it from someone older still. He didn't know how far back the chain went, but he believed it ran straight through Moundville. He said the old people there had not invented those rhythms. They had only built a place big enough to hold them. A river pilot named Caleb worked the Black Warrior in the late years of the steamboats. He kept a small journal. In one entry, dated October, he wrote that he had pulled his boat in below the mounds to wait out a fog. The fog was thick as wet flour. He could not see the bow from the wheelhouse. And in that grey hush, he wrote, he heard children laughing, high, clear voices, the way children sound when they are running. He stood on the deck and listened. The laughter moved across the bluff above him. Then it was gone. He wrote that he was not a superstitious man. He wrote it twice in the same paragraph, as if to convince himself. None of these people claimed to know what Moundville had been. They only knew what it felt like to stand near it. They felt the corn growing too well. They heard the humming on the water. They saw the sun click into a slot it had been carved to fit. They sensed a calendar still running somewhere underneath the grass, marking time by stars and harvests and the slow turning of a sky that does not forget the people who once watched it so carefully. Pull a bowl from the soft red clay of Moundville and turn it slowly in your hands. The surface is dark, almost black, polished smooth as the inside of a river stone. Around the rim, a thin line of engraving curls and circles back on itself. Look closer. That curl is a wing. The wing belongs to a bird, and the bird has a forked tail and a sharp eye, and once you see one, you see them everywhere. The potters of Moundville signed their bowls with birds, not their names exactly. Names belong to people, and people pass. The birds belong to something older, a family, a clan, a way of standing in the world that you carried from your grandmother and gave to your grandchildren. When a woman shaped a vessel and pressed a bird into its shoulder, she was telling you who she was without ever opening her mouth. That is where the pattern begins to show itself. For a long time the bowls were studied one by one. A pot from this grave, a bottle from that house floor, a jar broken in the dirt near the plaza. Each piece sat in its own drawer in its own museum, labeled with a number and a date. Then someone laid them out side by side, hundreds of them, and the shapes started to rhyme. The same bird appeared on bowls found half a mile apart. The same hand and eye motif showed up on a bottle near Mound G, and on a bowl pulled from a burial near Mound E. A scalloped sun rolled around the shoulder of one jar and around the lip of another that had been buried 20 years earlier. The potters were not working alone. They were working from a shared book that nobody ever wrote down. The book had a vocabulary, hands with eyes inside the palm, skulls drawn small and tidy like signatures, winged serpents that swam through the clay, forked tongues, crested birds, rays that fanned out from a central point like the spokes of a wheel. Each shape meant something, and each shape kept its meaning across generations. Then the dates began to line up. Archaeologists working with thermal tests and stratigraphy started sorting the pottery into rough centuries. The early bowls, made when Moundville was still loud with children and cook fires, leaned toward simple lines and open shapes. The later bowls, the ones made as the houses thinned out and the plazas grew quieter, leaned hard into the death imagery. More skulls, more bones, more hands wearing eyes. The birds stayed, but they grew sharper, more stylized, more solemn. The shift was not sudden. It was a slow tilt, like a boat settling deeper into the water. Over 100 years or so, the potters of Moundville began making vessels that seemed less suited for the kitchen and more suited for the grave. Cooking pots gave way to ceremonial bottles. Everyday jars gave way to offering bowls. The clay itself was finer in the later pieces, the polish deeper, the engraving more careful, as if the potters knew their work would go into the ground and stay there. The locations overlapped in a way that felt deliberate. Bowls with the hand and eye motif clustered around certain mounds. Bowls with the crested bird clustered around others. The forked eye design, that long downward stripe beneath the eye of a falcon, showed up most often in burials near the largest mounds. The patterns matched a map nobody had drawn. The clay was telling you, quietly, where the powerful had lived and where the powerful had been laid down. What makes this strange is the silence that surrounds it. No written explanation survives. No painted scroll. No song that anyone recorded. The bowls speak in a language whose grammar has been lost. We can see the words. We cannot quite read the sentences. Researchers have offered competing readings. One view holds that the birds and hands and eyes are clan markers, a quiet civic system telling you which family made which bowl for which ceremony. Another view holds that the symbols are religious, mapping a layered cosmos of sky world and middle world and beneath world, with the bird carrying souls between them. A third view says it is both at once, and that the people who made these bowls did not separate clan from cosmos the way we separate them now. What everyone agrees on is the rhyming. The bowls echo each other across decades. The same hands keep reappearing in the same places. A pattern is forming in the clay, and that pattern points towards something the city was becoming long before the last fire went cold. The diggers who first opened the soft earth of Moundville found something they did not expect. They came looking for post holes and pottery shards. They found a city that had quietly turned itself into a graveyard. Picture the slow work of it, a trowel scraping back red clay, the dust rising in soft clouds under the Alabama sun, then the gentle curve of a skull, smooth as river stone, resting where it had rested for 600 years. Beside it, a bowl. Beside the bowl, a folded copper plate the color of an autumn leaf. The bodies lay everywhere, not just in one mound or one corner, but woven through the whole site like seeds in a loaf of bread. Some rested in shallow pits, some lay stretched out under house floors. Some had been bundled, the bones gathered up after the flesh was gone, and tied into small parcels of cloth and grass, thousands upon thousands of them, layer beneath layer, generation beneath generation. And the things they carried with them into the dark were the strangest part. A child went into the ground with a string of freshwater pearls around her thin neck. A man was laid down with a stone axe, so finely polished it still caught the light like wet glass. Women were buried with small clay pots no bigger than a teacup, painted with the running shape of a crested bird. One grave held the skull of a hawk, placed carefully where a pillow would go. Another held the teeth of a black bear, drilled and strung as a collar. The richest burials sat inside the mounds themselves. Down through the packed earth, the diggers found chambers lined with logs and woven mats. Inside lay bodies dressed in finery that would have looked at home in a king's hall. Sheets of beaten copper shaped into long-nosed faces. Beads cut from conch shells hauled up from the Gulf, 600 miles to the south. Stone pallets carved with the image of a knotted serpent, their surfaces still stained red with the soft powder of crushed iron. Discs of polished sandstone, large as dinner plates, etched with a hand. In the center of the hand, an open eye. That eye stared up out of the earth at the men who lifted it free. It stares still from glass cases in quiet museums, waiting for someone to read what it means. The pattern of it puzzled the early researchers, and it puzzles them yet. In the early years of Moundville, when the plaza rang with voices and the cook fires sent their smoke into the sky, people were buried as people are buried in any living town. A few here, a few there. The dead rested near the living, the way a sleeping grandmother rests in the next room. The ordinary rhythm of a place where birth and death keep pace with each other. Then something changed, sometime around the year 1300. The burials began to outnumber the houses. The dead kept coming, but the living seemed to be going elsewhere. The hearths grew cold, the granaries fell into disrepair, and still the processions arrived at the river bend, carrying their wrapped bundles, their pots, their small treasures. Still the earth opened to take them in. One theory holds that this is the signature of a sacred city, a place that had become too holy to live in, the way a church is not a home. Families spread out across the countryside in smaller farming villages, and only returned to Moundville to bury their honored dead in ground that had been blessed by centuries of ceremony. The town became a cathedral. The cathedral became a cemetery. Another theory says something darker and simpler, that the leaders of Moundville lost their grip, that the old order of chiefs and priests began to crack, that the population fell because the system that had held them together had failed. And what we read as a sacred shift is really the long, quiet sigh of a kingdom dissolving. In this view, the burials are not a sign of devotion, but of inertia, the last threads of a custom that outlived the city that invented it. Both stories fit the bones. Neither story fully explains them. What is certain is this: for at least 200 years, the people of the Black Warrior Valley carried their dead to this bend in the river. They laid them down with copper and pearl and painted clay. They covered them with earth that other hands had carried, basket by basket, generations before, and they walked back into the green country, leaving the mounds to keep watch over a population that grew, year by year, more silent and more numerous than any town of the living. Think about it for a moment. 200 years of smoke. That is the strange thing about Moundville, the thing that does not quite fit any tidy story. Archaeologists have walked this ground for more than a century, and they keep coming back to one quiet detail that nobody can fully explain. The fires here burned for roughly 200 years without stopping. Not one fire, thousands of them. Cook fires in the houses, hearth fires in the plaza, ceremonial fires on the flat tops of the mounds. Year after year, generation after generation, smoke rose from this bend in the Black Warrior like breath. from a sleeping giant. Picture it from above. Picture a hawk circling on a still autumn afternoon around the year 1250. Below, the river curves like a dark green ribbon through the floodplain. The bluffs rise on one side, soft and wooded. On the other side, the land opens into a wide, flat plain, and on that plain sits the city, 29 earthen mounds arranged around a great central square, hundreds of thatched houses with cane walls and clay-packed floors, gardens of corn and squash and beans stretching out towards the edges, and smoke, threads of pale grey smoke rising from every roof, every plaza fire, every mound-top temple. The whole city breathing upward into the southern sky. Now hold that picture and let it run. Let the seasons turn. Let the years pass. The hawk dies. Its children die. Their children die. And the smoke keeps rising. The fires never go out. Old men who learned to walk by their mothers' hearths grow stooped and grey, and the same hearths still burn. New babies are born into kitchens that have not gone cold in living memory. Travellers coming down the river from the north must have seen the smoke before they ever saw the mounds. A soft grey smudge on the horizon, hanging low over the trees, marking the place where the ceremonial capital lived and breathed. 200 years is a hard span to hold in the mind. The United States is not yet 250 years old. The smoke over Moundville lasted nearly as long as our whole country has so far. Think of every cabin fire, every campfire, every kitchen stove that has glowed in America since 1776. Now imagine all of that happening in one place, one bend in one river, one small city of earth and cane and wood smoke, burning steadily through wars and droughts and harvests and floods. That is the impossible detail, not that they built the mounds, not that they shaped the plaza with such careful symmetry. Those things are remarkable, but they are explainable. People can move dirt. People can plan a city. What is harder to grasp is the patience of it, the sheer unbroken quietness of 2 centuries of daily life in one chosen place. And then it stopped. That is the part nobody can quite settle. Sometime in the 1300s, the fires began to thin. The houses around the plaza emptied. The cook fires went out, one by one, like candles guttering in a draughty room. The smoke that had risen for 200 years grew faint, and then it was gone. The mounds stayed. The plaza stayed. The bones in the ground stayed. But the breath of the city lifted away and did not come back. Some researchers say the people did not vanish so much as move. They spread out into smaller farming villages along the river, keeping the land but leaving the capital. The mounds, in this telling, became something different, not a home anymore. A place you came to, a place where the dead were carried, where the priests still walked, where the old ceremonies still happened on certain days of the year. A city of the dead with a skeleton crew of the living. Others are not so sure. They look at the same evidence and see something more sudden, a break, a turning, maybe a sickness, maybe a quarrel, maybe a slow loss of faith in whatever held the place together. A reason the smoke stopped rising that we cannot quite name from this distance. Both theories sit in the same rooms at the same conferences. Neither one fully wins. What stays with you, though, is not the ending. It is the duration. 200 years of smoke, 200 years of cooking and praying and laughing and grieving in one small bend of one Alabama river, long enough that the children of children of children grew up thinking the fires had always burned there, long enough that they probably believed the fires always would, and then, one quiet season, they did not. Now, there are people who hear all this talk of a great vanished city and shake their heads. They aren't being cruel. They aren't trying to spoil the story. They just want the evidence to do the heavy lifting. And, for a long time, the skeptics had a tidy argument about Moundville. They said the people who lived here were simple farmers, hard-working, yes, skilled with clay, sure, but not the heart of some grand network reaching across the continent. The skeptics said Moundville was a quiet little place that got dressed up in legend long after the fires went out. You can understand the logic. Most ancient villages stayed close to home. Most people in the old world ate what they grew and traded with the folks down the river bend. The skeptics looked at Moundville and saw mud, thatch, corn, and bone. They saw a town, not an empire. They said the wild stories about chiefs in copper and pearls were the kind of tales that grow taller every time a shovel turns the soil. Then the shovels kept turning, and the soil kept giving up things that didn't belong. Out of the red dirt came copper, sheets of it, beaten thin as paper, cut into the shapes of falcons and hands. Copper doesn't grow in Alabama. It comes from the cold blue lakes far to the north, from the rocky shores of Lake Superior, more than 1,000 miles away. Out of the dirt came shell, big whelk shells from the warm salt water of the Gulf, carved with curling designs. Out of the dirt came mica, peeled into thin, clear sheets like frozen sunlight. Mica comes from the mountains of the Appalachians. Out of the dirt came galena, a silvery lead ore hauled in from the hills of Missouri. The skeptics had to sit with that for a while. A simple farming town doesn't hold 1,000 miles of cargo in its earth. Somebody walked those goods here. Somebody paddled them down rivers and across portages. Somebody knew which trail through the pine forest led to which crossing, which bend, which friendly fire. The trade roads were real. They stretched like the veins on the back of a hand, from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf, from the Atlantic shore inland to the prairies, and Moundville sat near the middle of them, like a knot on a long rope. Still, the skeptics had a fair point to make. Trade goods can travel without travelers. A shell from the Gulf can pass through 20 hands before it reaches Alabama. Each hand trades it a little farther. Nobody has to walk the whole 1,000 miles. So the copper bird in a Moundville grave doesn't prove that a man from Moundville ever saw Lake Superior. It only proves that the bird somehow made its way south. That's a reasonable thing to say. It keeps the story honest. It reminds you that legend likes to fill in blanks that evidence leaves empty. But here is where even the careful doubters tend to slow down. The copper at Moundville isn't just raw metal. It's worked. It's hammered into the shape of a specific bird, with a specific eye marking in, a specific style that shows up at other great Mississippian centers, like Cahokia near the Mississippi River and Etowah in Georgia. The same shapes, the same lines around the eye, the same posture of the falcon, wings cocked, head turned. You don't get that by accident. You don't get it by passing raw lumps of metal hand to hand across a continent. You get it because people in these distant places shared something deeper than goods. They shared a story. They shared a way of seeing the world. They shared an image of a sacred being that mattered enough to copy faithfully across 1,000 miles of forest and river. The skeptics can explain the copper. They can explain the shell. They can explain the mica and the galena. One by one, what they have a harder time explaining is the matching iconography, the shared symbols, the fact that a chief at Moundville and a chief at Cahokia and a chief at Etowah all wore the same falcon on their chests and seemed to know what it meant. So, the picture sits somewhere in the middle. Moundville wasn't the lonely village the old skeptics imagined. It also wasn't quite the bustling capital of an organized empire some early dreamers painted. It was something stranger, a place plugged into a continent, a place that traded in ideas as much as in copper and shell, a place whose silence today only deepens the question of what it once was. There are people who look at the pottery from Moundville and see more than clay. They see a language, they see a faith, they see proof that the people who lived along this bend in the river were not just farmers and traders, but believers in something vast and ordered and real. These are the artists, the elders, the quiet scholars who have spent their lives turning these images over in their hands. They speak softly, they do not argue, they simply know what they see. The image they return to, again and again, is the Falcon dancer picture. A man carved or painted in profile, his arms spread wide, his body draped in feathers, his eyes ringed in a strange forked mark that runs down each cheek like a black tear. He wears a copper plate on his chest. He holds a severed head in one hand and a ceremonial mace in the other. He is dancing, or flying, or both at once. This figure shows up on shell cups from the Tennessee Valley. He shows up on copper plates buried in Georgia mounds. He shows up etched into stone pallets pulled from the soil at Moundville itself. The same posture, the same forked eye, the same feathered cloak. From the Mississippi headwaters to the Gulf Coast, the Falcon dancer wears the same face. To the believers, this is not a coincidence. It is a creed. They will tell you the forked eye is the mark of the peregrine, the fastest bird in the sky, a hunter who falls from the clouds like a stone. They will tell you the dancer is a warrior priest who borrowed the falcon's spirit, who could see what mortals could not, who carried the souls of the dead into the upper world. They will tell you the copper on his chest was the metal of the sun, and the shell beneath his feet was the bone of the sea, and the dance itself was the hinge between them. You may believe this, or you may not. The believers do not press you. What they will tell you is that the iconography is too consistent across too many miles to be decoration alone. A potter in Alabama and a carver in Oklahoma both rendered the same forked eye in the same way for the same reason. They shared a story, they shared a sky, they shared a sense of what the world was made of and how a person was supposed to move through it. The skeptics push back gently. They say similar images do not always mean identical beliefs. A symbol can travel without its meaning intact. A trader from the Black Warrior could carry a copper plate north, and the people who received it might honor it for reasons of their own. The Falcon dancer might be one figure to one town and a different figure to the next. This is a fair point. The believers nod and keep working. Some of them are descendants of the Mississippian peoples. Some are Choctaw and Chickasaw and Muskogee elders who grew up with stories their grandparents whispered. Around wood stoves, they speak of upper worlds and lower worlds, of birds that carry messages between them, of dances that open doors. When they look at the forked eye on a 1,000-year-old bowl, they do not see a stranger. They see a relative. It cost them something to say this out loud. For a long time, the academic world treated oral tradition as folklore, and folklore as fiction. The Descendants kept the stories anyway. They told them at kitchen tables, and at council meetings, and at quiet graveside gatherings. They did not need a journal article to confirm what their bones already knew. What they gained by not staying silent is a slow turning of the conversation. Younger archaeologists now sit with elders before they dig. Museum labels now name the peoples whose ancestors made the objects on display. The Falcon dancer, once filed under nameless prehistory, is now spoken of by his proper kinship. None of this answers the central question. We still do not know exactly what Moundville's priests believed about death, about the soul, about the journey from this world to the next. We still cannot read the forked eye, the way we read a letter. The faith is recovered only in fragments, like a song heard through a closed door. The believers say, that is enough for now. They say the dancer is still dancing somewhere, in the upper air above the river. And the bowls in the museum cases are not relics but signatures. Someone signed their name to the sky 1,000 years ago. The ink has not yet faded. The land remembers things people forget. You can stand on the bluff above the Black Warrior River today and feel it, even if you cannot name it. The grass grows in patterns that follow old walls nobody drew on a map. The trees lean a certain way, as though listening to a wind that stopped blowing centuries ago. The ground itself has a memory, and at Moundville, that memory speaks of thirst. Look at the cypress stumps along the slow bends of the river. Scientists who study old wood have learned to read the rings inside them like pages in a book. A wet year leaves a wide ring, pale and generous. A dry year leaves a thin band, dark and tight, the wood pinched against itself. Around the late 1300s, the rings begin to tighten. They squeeze together like the pages of a closed book. Year after year, the wood writes the same word, dry, dry, dry. No one at Moundville carved this story onto a tablet. No scribe sat in the plaza and counted the lost harvests. But the trees counted. The trees always count. And the river kept its own ledger too, in layers of silt and sand that settled where the water once ran higher. When the flood stopped coming, the floodplain stopped feeding the soil. The cornfields that ringed the city began to whisper instead of sing. You can see the shape of those old fields if you walk the bottoms in the right light. The ground rolls in low ridges, soft as a sleeping shoulder under a quilt. These were the raised garden rows, where women planted corn and beans and squash together, the three sisters leaning on one another. The ridges still hold their shape after 600 years. Rain comes and goes, plows pass over, but the earth keeps the bones of what it once carried. Walk farther, past the third mound, into the meadow that slopes toward the creek. There is a patch of ground there where the grass grows thin and yellow, no matter the season. Farmers in the 1800s tried to break it for cotton and gave up. The plow blades skipped across something hard underneath, something packed and refused. Later, archaeologists found a clay floor down there, a great burned floor where a building had stood and then come down in fire. The land had been holding that scar quietly for centuries, refusing to forget. There are other places like it across the site, hollows where deer will not bed down, rises where lightning seems to strike more than chance allows, a spring that runs cold in summer and warmer in winter, as if it remembers a different climate. The old people who farmed this country in the 1800s knew these spots by feel. They called some of them lucky and some unlucky and some just strange. They built their barns elsewhere. The river itself has changed its mind more than once. You can trace old channels in the low woods, soft green ribbons, where the water used to run, and where now only frogs sing in the spring. The Black Warrior used to curl tighter against the bluff, pressing close to the mounds like a hand cupped around a candle. Then it pulled back. The current shifted. Sandbars rose where deep pools had been. Whether this happened before the city emptied or after, no one can say with certainty. Both are possible. The land does not date its own changes. Trees give another clue. In a few corners of the old site, the forest grows wrong. The hardwoods stand in even rows, the wrong age, the wrong mix for a wild Alabama bottom. These are the ghosts of clearings. Where a town once stood, the land takes a long time to forget the shape of streets and houses. Sun reaches the soil differently. Seeds settle differently. 100 years after the last fire goes out, the second growth forest still shows the floor plan of what came before. So when researchers talk about why Moundville changed, why the houses thinned and the burials thickened, the Drought sits in the conversation like an old uncle who saw something he will not quite explain. Maybe the thin rings in the cypress wood mean nothing. Maybe people left for reasons no climate can touch. Or maybe the corn shrank year by year, and the ceremonies grew larger to answer the shrinking, and the city slowly turned its face from the living to the dead, because the dead were the only ones still arriving in numbers. The land will not tell you which, but it remembers. Every ring, every ridge, every patch of stubborn ground. Around the year 1450, the fires at Moundville went cold. Not all at once, not in a single dark season, but over the span of a few generations. The cook fires in the houses around the plaza burned down to ash and were not rebuilt. The smoke that had risen from the river bend for 200 years thinned, and then it was gone. The town did not vanish. The mound still stood. The dead still came. But the living, the families, the children, the potters and weavers and farmers, drifted away into the countryside and never came back in those numbers again. The strange part is that Moundville was not alone. If you look at a map of the old Mississippian world, you see a string of great river towns. Cahokia, near the meeting of the Mississippi and the Missouri. Etowah, down in northern Georgia. Spiro out in eastern Oklahoma. Angel on the Ohio. Aztalan, up in Wisconsin. Each one had its mounds and its plaza, its ranked chiefs and its sacred objects. Each one rose like a slow tide between the years 900 and 1200, and each one, in its own time, went quiet. Cahokia had been the largest of them all, a city of perhaps 20,000 souls, with a great pyramid of earth, taller than a 10-story building. By 1350, a full century before Moundville's fires cooled, Cahokia stood empty. The plaza grew over in grass. The wooden stockade rotted in the rain. Nobody wrote down why. Nobody marked the last day. The pattern repeats. Etowah's mounds saw their final ceremonies in the 15th century, Spiro's elite burials, packed with shell cups and copper plates, stopped being added around the same window. Aztalan, far to the north, had emptied even earlier, one by one. The great towns of the Mississippian world dimmed like candles in a long hallway, each one snuffed in its turn, and nobody can fully explain it. The theories stack up like river stones. Some researchers point to climate. Tree rings from across the continent show a long drying trend in the late 1300s and 1400s, a cooling that historians sometimes call the Little Ice Age. Corn yields would have fallen, floods would have come at the wrong times. A city of 10,000 mouths cannot bend much before it breaks. Others point to politics. The Mississippian world ran on chiefs, and chiefs ran on tribute. When one bad harvest follows another, the gifts thin out. The painted bowls stop arriving from the outer villages. The young men stop carrying baskets of earth up the mound. A chiefdom is a kind of agreement, and agreements can be quietly withdrawn. Still others speak of disease, or warfare, or a shift in belief itself. Maybe the old gods stopped answering. Maybe a new way of seeing the world spread along the trade roads, and the great central towns simply lost their meaning. People did not die in droves. They walked away. What makes Moundville unusual in this gallery of fading cities is the way its purpose seemed to shift before its people left. The houses emptied, but the burials kept coming. The plaza, once full of voices and cook smoke and children's feet, became a stage for the dead. Pottery, painted with skulls and hands and forked eyes, piled up in the graves. The town became, in the words of more than one archaeologist, an acropolis, a city of bones. Cahokia did not do this. Cahokia simply ended. Etowah did not do this in the same way. Spiro had its great mortuary chamber, but the surrounding town had already thinned. Moundville is the one that lingered as a place of the dead, long after the living had walked into the woods. Why here? Why this way? Nobody knows. One view holds that Moundville's transformation was a deliberate choice, a sacred reshaping of the town into a doorway for the ancestors. The chiefs may have decided that the plaza would serve the dead better than the living. The mounds, after all, were already houses for those who had gone before. Pulling the daily life away from the river bend may have been a way of giving the ground over to its true owners. The other view is gentler and sadder. The people did not choose. The fields failed. The chiefs lost their hold. The families packed what they could carry and went to smaller villages along smaller creeks, and the only ones left to honor the old plaza were those who came back year after year to bury their grandparents in the soil where the great fires once burned. Both stories may be true. Neither story is finished. The river kept moving. The mounds kept their silence. And somewhere out there, the same pattern was playing out under different skies. Picture a clay pot, small enough to cradle in two hands. The shoulder of the pot is painted with a black band, and along that band a hand reaches out, palm open, with an eye drawn right in the center. The clay is soft brown, almost the color of wet riverbank. The pot was found tucked into the earth at Moundville, set beside a person who had been laid to rest with care. And the pot is broken, not shattered, broken on purpose, with a clean hole knocked through the base, the way you might let air out of something so it could not hold anything ever again. Archaeologists call that ritual killing. The idea is simple. The pot dies with the person. You can hold the pieces in your hand today, in the museum at Moundville, and feel the cool weight of clay that someone pressed and painted 600 years ago. The break is still there. The hand and eye still stare up at the light. Pieces like this are scattered all through the late layers of the city, hundreds of them. Bowls with skulls painted around the rim, jars shaped like crested birds, effigy pots with human faces, the eyes hollow, the mouths slightly open, as if the clay person had something to say and lost the words. Each one made with skill that would humble a modern potter. Each one buried in soil that was once a neighborhood. But here is the strange thing. The houses are gone. The cooking pits are gone. The trash heaps that mark a living town, full of fish bones and corn cobs and broken tools. Those layers thin out and almost vanish in the years after about 1300. What remains, in heavy concentration, are the burials and the painted pots that traveled with them. The artifacts tell a story of a place that kept receiving people long after it stopped feeding them. You can see it in the soil itself. Lower layers hold the dark stains of post holes, the floors of family houses, the ash of daily hearths. Higher layers hold graves, row after row of them, tucked around the mounds, packed close to the plaza, set in tidy alignment with the cardinal directions. The dirt of Moundville changes color as you dig down, going from the gray of habitation to the warmer brown of the buried. A whole town turned slowly into a cemetery, and the artifacts mark the turn. Some of the objects had traveled a long way before they came to rest in that soil. Copper sheets cut into the shape of falcons, a metal hammered thin as a fingernail. The source mines hundreds of miles to the north. Shell cups carved from the great whelk shells of the Gulf Coast, their inner surfaces etched with dancers and serpents. Greenstone celts, polished smooth, quarried from the southern mountains. Mica, from the Carolinas, cut into sheets that catch the light like frost. These things did not wander in by accident. Someone carried them up the rivers and the trails, and someone placed them with the dead, and then the placing stopped. There are letters too, written much later, that mention these objects without knowing what they were. A farmer in the 1840s wrote to a relative in Tennessee about plowing up a copper plate near the river bend. He described it as thin as paper, shaped like a bird, with strange lines cut into the wings. He thought it was Spanish. He thought maybe pirates had buried it. He put it on a shelf in his barn and used it for a while to weigh down a stack of seed envelopes. That plate is now in a museum drawer. The lines on its wings match other plates found 1,000 miles away. A steamboat clerk in 1846 wrote in his logbook about passing the bluffs and seeing pottery shards washing out of the bank after a hard rain. He picked up a piece with a hand and eye painted on it. He kept it in his pocket for a week, then traded it for tobacco in Mobile. Where that piece went, nobody knows, but the river still gives up pieces like it every spring, when the high water carves the bank fresh. The artifacts make the harder question impossible to wave away. People kept coming back to Moundville after they stopped living there. They carried their dead a long way to be buried in that ground. They brought their most precious things and let them go into the soil. Whatever drove the living away did not break the hold the place had on them. The walk away from the city was also, somehow, a walk that kept circling back. Between the leaving and the finding, there is a long quiet. Hundreds of years where the Mounds sat in the river bend, and almost nobody wrote a word about them. The cornfields went back to grass. The grass went back to cane and pine vines, climbed the slopes of the great earthen platforms, and stitched them into the green Alabama woods like old quilts pulled over sleeping shoulders. The people who left did not vanish from the world. There, scattered into smaller towns along smaller creeks. Some moved south, some moved east toward the Coosa. They carried the stories with them, the way you carry a grandmother's recipe, repeating the steps without always knowing why. The shape of a bowl, the set of a roof beam, the way a clan name passes from mother to daughter, like a soft coin worn smooth. In the kitchens and around the winter fires, the old city kept living, not as a place on a map, but as a feeling in the bones. Children heard about a great town on a wide river. They heard about a chief who stood on a hill higher than the trees. They heard about a plaza so big you could not see one end from the other. The details bent a little with each, telling the river got wider, the mounds got taller, the chief got kinder or grander, depending on who was listening. Some details fell away. The exact count of the mounds, for one. The names of the families who tended the fires, the songs that opened the ceremonies at first light. Those things lived in the mouths of certain elders. And when those elders died in a hard winter, or a sudden fever, the songs went with them like smoke pulled up a chimney. Other details polished themselves smooth. The story of the copper-feathered dancer, the story of the great gathering when 10,000 people stood in the plaza and the drums shook the river, the story of the long walk away when the elders said the time had come and the cook fires were banked one last time. These stories held their shape because people loved them. A story people love is harder to lose than a story people only know. The Spanish came through the south, in the 1500s. They wrote down a few names and burned a few villages and rode on. They did not see Moundville at its full glory. By then, the residential city was already old and quiet, more a place of memory than a place of markets. The chroniclers scratched their notes by candlelight and missed the larger thing in front of them. The French came up from the Gulf in the next century. They built forts at Mobile and traded along the rivers. They heard whispers about old earthworks in the interior. They sketched maps with rivers shaped roughly right, and everything in between filled with guesses. The mounds on the Black Warrior sat just outside their sketches, hidden behind a wall of cane and cypress. The English came too, and after them the new Americans, with their wagons and their hungry plows. Families settled along the bottomlands, drawn by the same rich soil that drew the first builders. They built cabins of split pine and raised hogs in the canebrakes. They saw the mounds. Of course they saw them. You cannot miss a 50-foot hill of earth shaped like a flat-topped pyramid sitting in a field, but seeing is not the same as understanding. The settlers told their own stories now. Some said the mounds were natural, just odd hills the river had left behind. Some said giants had built them in a time before time. Some said the Spanish themselves had thrown them up as forts. The truth that a whole city had stood here, that a chief in copper and pearls had ruled from that high platform, was not yet a story the newcomers could tell. So the centuries folded over the place like layers of leaves. Each generation added a thin coat of moss. Each generation forgot a little more and invented a little more to fill the gap. The descendant families who still carried the real memory did not always share it. They had reasons. They had learned what happened to people who spoke too freely about old ways. The mounds waited. They did what mounds do. They held their shape against the rain. They watched the river curl past in its slow brown turns. They listened to crickets and bullfrogs and the long sigh of summer heat rising off the fields. And somewhere, in a quiet cabin or a winter camp, or a grandmother's quiet kitchen, the real story of the great town on the Black Warrior kept on being told, one careful sentence at a time. By the early 1800s, the great city was already long gone. The plaza had filled with grass. The mounds had softened under 300 springs of rain. The river still bent the same way, still ran the same dark color, still carried the same smell of clay and fish and whetstone. But the people who lived along it now were not the people who had built it. They were farmers, settlers from Tennessee and the Carolinas, men with mules and plows and stubborn dreams of cotton. They cleared the canebrakes. They burned the underbrush. They drove iron blades into ground that had not been worked in this way before. And that is when the strange stones started coming up. A blade would catch on something hard. The farmer would stop. He would crouch in the fresh-turned dirt and brush away the soil with the side of his hand. Sometimes it was a piece of pottery, smooth and dark, with a curving line scratched into its side. Sometimes it was a stone disc, polished to a soft shine, with a hole bored through the middle. Sometimes it was a bead of carved shell, no bigger than a fingernail, white as a tooth. The farmers did not know what these things were. They held them up to the light. They turned them over. They felt the weight of them in their palms. Most of them did not throw the objects away. That part is worth pausing on. A busy man with a field to plant could have tossed the pieces in the brush and gone on with his day. But the stones felt like something. They felt made. They felt held. So the farmers brought them home. They set them on mantles above the fireplace. They put them in cigar boxes in the back of the cupboard. They showed them to their children on Sunday afternoons. The children grew up knowing that the ground under their feet was older than anything else they had ever heard about. Word spread, the word always spreads in farm country. One man would mention to another, over a fence line, that he had turned up a clay pot with a hand carved into it. The other man would say he had found something too. A pipe shaped like a frog, a flat stone shaped like a bird's wing, a skull bead the size of a pea. The mounds themselves stood quiet through all of this, 29 of them, green and rounded, rising from the bottom land like the backs of sleeping animals. The largest one looked like a hill, the smallest ones looked like nothing more than swells in a pasture. Cows grazed on their flanks. Boys climbed them on summer evenings to watch the sun go down over the river. The people who lived here did not have a name for what they were standing on. They called the largest mound the Indian Mound, which is what people call most mounds when they do not know what else to say. They knew, in some vague way, that natives had been here before. They did not know that this had been a city. They did not know that 10,000 people had once walked the ground where their corn now grew. They did not know about the Falcon dancer, or the forked eye, or the smoke that had risen for 200 years, but they knew something. The objects told them. The mounds told them. The careful shape of the plaza, even softened by time, told them. Something had happened here, something that mattered. That is the quiet truth that sits underneath every theory and every debate. Before the archaeologists came with their measuring tapes, before the academic papers and the museum cases and the careful catalogue numbers, before anyone asked whether this was a city of the living or a city of the dead, a falling kingdom or a rising shrine, before any of that, they were just farmers in a field, holding small carved things in their hands and feeling the weight of a question they could not quite ask. They did not need a theory. They did not need to solve it. They only needed to understand, in the simple way that a person understands such things, that the ground they tilled had once been holy to somebody, that somebody had carried these beads on a cord around the neck, that somebody had drunk from this clay cup, that somebody had loved this place enough to build it up out of baskets of earth, one basket at a time. The plows kept turning, the strange stones kept rising, and the river, as always, kept on running. Stand here for a moment at the edge of the Black Warrior River on a night in the middle of the 19th century. The water moves slow and dark beside you, broad as a country road. The air smells of river mud and cottonwood leaves. Somewhere out in the cane, a frog calls once, then stops. The stars hang heavy over Alabama, so thick they almost crowd the sky. You are not alone here. Behind you rise the mounds. You cannot see them clearly in the dark, but you can feel them. They are great soft shapes, rounded humps of earth. 29 of them, gathered like sleeping animals along the river bend. Grass covers them now. Vines climb their flanks. Pines have grown up where temples once stood. But the shape of the old city is still here, written into the ground itself. Listen for the river. There, far off, you hear the long, low call of a steamboat whistle drifting up the channel. The sound carries for miles on a still night like this. A paddle wheel chuffs softly somewhere downstream, working its way through the bends. A lantern flickers far out on the water, gold as a candle behind glass. The boat is moving slow, feeling for the channel, watching for snags and sandbars in the dark. The captain at the wheel knows this river. He knows every cut and shoal, and he knows these mounds. He has counted them from the deck many times, watching them slide past on the starboard side. He has noted them on his pilot's chart in pencil. Some captains made their own little maps of the bend, sketching the mounds as landmarks. The big flat one, the tall one beside it, the cluster of smaller ones inland, They used them the way sailors use lighthouses, to know where they were on a moonless night. The captain has heard the stories. He has talked to farmers who plow the fields nearby. He has seen the pieces of clay pot, the stone tools, the small carved beads they pull out of the dirt each spring. He does not know who built these hills. Nobody he can ask knows. The people who shaped them are long gone from this bend, but he has come to love them in his quiet way. They mark his road home. The whistle calls again, softer now, farther off. You can hear the steady chuff of the engine fade as the boat rounds the next bend. Then the river is quiet again. A breeze stirs the cane. A barred owl asks its old question from the trees behind you, and another answers from across the water. Walk a few steps onto the soft grass. The biggest mound rises ahead of you, dark against the stars. It is taller than a 4-story house. The slope is gentle, padded with summer grass and clover. If you climbed it now, you would feel the long ramp under your feet. The careful angle worked into the earth 800 years ago. From the top, the whole river bend would open out below you, a slow silver curve under the moonless sky. The men who built this hill worked by baskets of clay, one load at a time. They sang while they carried. They climbed and dumped and climbed again, year after year, generation after generation. And now you stand at the foot of their work in the deep quiet, and the cicadas thrum in the trees, and the river runs past, and none of it knows that centuries have gone by. The night air is warm and soft as worn cloth. Fireflies drift up out of the grass in slow green sparks. They rise and fall, blinking, drawing little maps of their own in the dark. Above them, the Milky Way pours across the sky in a long pale river, mirroring the one at your feet. You feel small here, small in a good way. Small the way a child feels in a great quiet church. The mounds do not threaten you. They simply hold their place, as they have held it through every flood and drought and turning of the seasons. The steamboat captain felt this too, when he passed in the dark with his lantern lit. He knew he was traveling through somebody else's old country, and he tipped his hat to it as he went. Stand a while longer. Let the river sound settle in your ears. Let the stars come down close. The captain's chart is yellowed in some archive now. His pencil marks faded, but the mounds he sketched are still here, still keeping their slow vigil over the bend, still waiting for the next visitor to come and stand quietly in the grass and wonder. After the steamboat captain came the men with shovels. They arrived in buggies and on foot, in stiff collars and dusty boots, carrying notebooks bound in black cloth and pencils sharpened to fine points. They came down the long red roads that wound through the pine flats of West Alabama, past the cotton fields and the slow farms, until the river opened before them and the mounds rose out of the bottomland like green islands. They had read the captain's maps. They had heard the rumors of pottery turned up by plows, and they wanted to see for themselves. The first of them was a Philadelphia man named Clarence Moore, who came up the Black Warrior in 1905 on a flat-bottomed steamboat called the Gopher. He tied off at the bend below the mounds and stepped ashore in a white linen suit. Moore was a wealthy bachelor who spent his days digging into mounds up and down the southern rivers. He kept careful drawings. He photographed every find, and when he left Moundville 2 seasons later, his boat rode lower in the water than it had on the way in, weighed down with crates of pottery, copper and stone. Moore's books, printed in soft green covers, sent ripples through every museum in the country. He drew the bowls with their winged serpents. He sketched the hands with eyes inside the palms. He published the skull pots and the Falcon dances, and the strange little discs cut from sandstone. Scholars in Boston and Washington and Chicago read his pages and understood, for the first time, that something enormous had once stood on that quiet bend of river. Then came the people from the state. In the 1930s, in the deep years of the Depression, the federal government sent workers down to Moundville to dig under the eye of trained archaeologists. They were young men mostly, from the surrounding counties, men who needed the $1 a day the program paid. They learned to scrape soil with trowels. They learned to sift dirt through screens of fine wire. They learned to write down everything, even the things that looked like nothing at all. Those workers uncovered more than 2,000 graves. They mapped the Plaza. They traced the line of the old stockade wall and found the dark stains where its posts had once stood. They built a small museum from local stone with high ceilings and cool tile floors. And they laid the artifacts out behind glass for anyone to come and see. The state called the place a park. The locals just called it the Mounds. A way of life grew up around the digging. Children in Hale and Tuscaloosa counties learned the names of the motifs before they learned long division. They knew the hand and eye. They knew the forked eye of the Falcon. They could spot a piece of Moundville pottery in a creek bed at 20 paces, and they knew, by some unspoken rule passed down on porches, that you left it where it lay, or you carried it gently to the park. Each autumn, the town holds a festival. Drummers come from Oklahoma, where many Descendants now live, and they set up in the grass beside Mound B. The drums roll low and slow under the pecan trees. Dancers in shell and feather move in slow circles on the plaza, where 600 years before, other dancers moved the same way. Vendors sell fry bread and beadwork. Children chase each other up the long slope of Mound A and stand at the top with their arms out, pretending to be chiefs in copper crowns. People who grew up here carry the mounds inside them. They speak of the place softly, the way you speak of a sleeping relative. They will tell you that the light hits different on the plaza in October. They will tell you that the deer come down to the river at dusk and stand a long time before drinking. They will tell you that you can feel the old city under your feet if you walk barefoot in the cut grass. The archaeologists kept coming through the decades. Some came with ground-penetrating radar. Some came with new theories and old arguments. They argued whether Moundville died slow or fast, whether it emptied by plan or by panic, whether the great quiet that fell over it was holy or hungry. They argued in journals and at conferences and over coffee in the little cafe down the road. And the Mounds, as always, listened without answering, holding their secret the way a closed hand holds a smooth river stone, warm from being carried a long, long way. The river never stops working, even when the town above it sleeps, even when the mounds sit quiet under a quilt of grass. The black warrior keeps moving along its old bend. It nibbles at the bank. It pulls a little earth loose with every rain, and sometimes, when the water drops in late summer, the river hands something back to the world, a piece of pottery, smooth as river stone, with a faint hand pressed into the clay, a shell bead, white as milk, polished by centuries of dark water, a shard of carved sandstone with the shape of a bird still curling along its edge. The people who live along this river know to look down when they walk the banks after a storm. They have always known. There was a man named Henry. He grew up near the bend in the early years of the last century, back when the cotton fields still ran right up to the foot of the largest mound. His grandmother told him the stories. She told him the mound was not just a hill. She told him the river was not just water. She told him the bowls his mother kept on the high shelf the ones with the strange long-fingered hands painted on the sides, had come up out of the dirt when his great-grandfather plowed the lower field. Henry left Alabama when he was 19. He went north, the way so many young men went north in those years. He carried a small canvas bag and one good shirt and a piece of broken pottery wrapped in a handkerchief. The piece was no bigger than his palm. It showed half of an eye, the lid forked into two soft points, the pupil round and dark as a well. He kept that piece of clay on the windowsill of every room he ever rented. In Detroit he worked in a factory that smelled of hot oil and burning metal. The light up there came in grey slabs through dirty glass. The winter wind off the lake was a different animal than the wet, soft wind of the Black Warrior. But every evening, when he came home with his hands aching, he would set his lunch pail down and look at the little broken eye on the sill, and for a moment the kitchen would go quiet in a way no city kitchen should be quiet, and he could almost smell the pine smoke and the river mud of home. He told his children about the Mounds. He told them in the long way, the way his grandmother had told him, where the story takes a whole evening and the kettle goes on twice. He told them about the chief who wore copper. He told them about the plaza that once held 10,000 voices. He told them about the smoke that rose from the river bend for 200 years, and then one season simply stopped. His children listened the way children listen. Some of it stuck, some of it slid past, but the youngest daughter kept asking. She wanted to know what the forked eye meant. She wanted to know why the people left. She wanted to know if there were still bowls in the dirt down there, waiting. Henry did not have answers. He only had the piece of clay and the stories his grandmother had given him, and the soft sense that something important had happened on that bend in the river, something the books at the library never quite caught. When he was an old man, Henry took the train south one last time. His daughter went with him. They drove out to the park that had grown up around the Mounds, and they walked the long path past the plaza, and Henry stood at the foot of the biggest mound and did not speak for a long time. The river was low that day. They walked the bank together, and the daughter, who had grown up in a grey northern city listening to her father's southern stories, bent down and picked up a small piece of pottery the river had washed out overnight. It had a shape on it, a spiral, old as anything. She did not take it home. She set it back where she found it, the way her father told her to. This is how the story has traveled. Not in museums, not in textbooks, in handkerchiefs, and on windowsills, and in the slow voices of grandparents who remember what their grandparents remembered. The river keeps washing the past back into the light, and somewhere in cities that look nothing like Moundville, in kitchens that have never smelled pine smoke, people still keep watch for it. There is a quiet truth about Moundville that the early diggers missed. They wrote about the place as if it were finished, as if the people who built it had gone the way of smoke. They used words like vanished. They used words like lost. They wrote about the Mounds the way you might write about a shipwreck on the bottom of the sea. The people they were writing about were sitting maybe 2 states away, listening to the rain on a tin roof, eating cornbread, raising children. The Choctaw never went anywhere mysterious. The Chickasaw never disappeared. The Muskogee Creek were pushed west on a road of grief, but they did not stop being themselves. The Alabama and the Coasati and a dozen related peoples carried their songs across the Mississippi River and into Oklahoma, and they carried them carefully, like a person carries a candle through wind. The fires of Moundville did not go out. They moved. That is the part the old books got wrong. The Descendants did not vanish with the Mounds. They simply walked and kept walking and built new towns, And then those towns were taken too, and they walked again. The story of Moundville is not the story of a dead city. It is the story of a living people whose great-grandparents' great-grandparents once stood on a mound at sunrise and watched the river bend below them like a curl of green ribbon today. If you go to Moundville on a soft autumn afternoon, you might see a group of visitors walking the plaza with quiet faces. Some of them have traveled a very long way. They have come from Oklahoma, from Mississippi, from Louisiana. They have come because their grandmothers told them stories. They have come because a piece of pottery in a museum case carries a shape their family still paints on the inside of a bowl. They have come to stand where the old people stood. Some of them will not speak much. Some will leave small offerings in the grass. Some will simply look at the river and at the mounds and at the wide, soft sky, and they will recognize the place the way you might recognize a face you have only ever seen in a photograph. This is what makes the mystery of Moundville different from other mysteries. It is not a closed door. It is not a riddle sealed inside a tomb. The people who could tell us the most about what happened here are still here, still telling their own children, still keeping ceremonies that the archaeologists were never invited to watch. They have their own answers. They are simply under no obligation to share them with strangers. So the question that has followed us through every chapter of this story remains open in a particular way. The diggers can tell you when the wall was built and when it was burned. The pollen scientists can tell you when the corn yields fell. The bone studies can tell you what the elite ate and what the common people ate, and how their lives bent under the weight of difference. The pottery can be sorted and dated and grouped into styles and phases, but the why of the silent city, the why of the great quieting, the why of a place that filled with the dead, while the living drifted away, that question lives in a different country. It lives in songs that are still sung. It lives in clan names. It lives in the slow movement of a hand over a drum. Maybe Moundville was always meant to become what it became. Maybe the shift toward burial was not collapse, but completion. Maybe the city was always pointed toward the next world, and the day came when the living simply stepped back to let the dead have the ground. Maybe the leaving was a kindness. Maybe the silence was a gift the people gave to the place that had given them everything. Or maybe it was sorrow. Maybe the drought and the sickness and the loosening of the old order and the rise of new towns elsewhere, all of it together pulled the city apart the way a slow current pulls apart a raft. Both can be true at once. That is the nature of folklore. That is the nature of memory. The answer does not have to be one thing. The descendants who never really left know this. They live with a story that has more than one ending. They walk the mounds on quiet afternoons, and they do not need the mystery to be solved, because the mystery is not a wound. It is a long, slow, patient inheritance, passed down like a piece of warm cloth from hand to hand across the centuries. So here we are, you and I, at the end of the long walk along the Black Warrior River. The fire has burned down to a soft red bed of coals. The night around us is wide and deep and quiet, and the story of Moundville sits between us like a stone someone placed there 1,000 years ago, still warm from the hand that left it. We have walked the plaza together. We have stood on top of Mound A and watched the sun roll along the far ridge. We have heard the names of the chiefs who wore copper and pearls, and we have followed the smoke that rose from cook fires for 200 years before it thinned and vanished into a softer kind of sky. We have seen the bowls with their painted hands and forked eyes. We have felt the slow tilt of the city as it changed from a place of the living into a place of the honored dead. And still, the question remains, Nobody can say for certain why the people of Moundville rebuilt their city into a quiet field of mounds. Nobody can say if it was a turning of the heart toward the ancestors, or a slow loosening of the old power, or some braid of the two that we will never fully untangle. The river keeps its own counsel. The mounds keep theirs. That, in a way, is the gift of a place like this. It does not give up its answers. It does not hand you a tidy ending you can fold